I've been doing intelligence work for 22 years. I've sat across tables from warlords who could crush a shuttle with their bare hands. I've watched species that don't even have a word for mercy negotiate treaties in rooms where the air itself felt like it was holding its breath. I've seen things that would make most people forget how to sleep at night. And I can tell you, without any exaggeration, without any performance, that nothing I ever witnessed in those 22 years came close to what happened on the observation deck of the INS Velorath on the night of the Tarakan Accords. Not even close. But here's the thing about moments that change everything: they don't announce themselves. They don't walk in with sirens and drums, they come quietly. They come wearing an Aide's uniform. They come carrying a data pad and a cup of someone else's coffee, standing 3 steps behind a woman who doesn't even remember your name. That's how Marcus Elian Croft walked into history. And that's how he walked out of it too. Let me set the scene properly, because you need to understand what the INS Velorath was before you can understand what happened on it. The Velorath was a Keth-class diplomatic cruiser, and the Keth class was, and still is, the most prestigious class of vessel in the interspecies coalition fleet. It wasn't built for war. It was built for presence. It was built to communicate, through its sheer architectural grandeur, that whoever stood on its decks mattered. That the conversations happening inside its chambers meant something. The hull was constructed from Velorite alloy, which gives off this deep, almost bruised purple sheen when starlight hits it at certain angles, and the observation deck ran the entire circumference of the upper tier. 360 degrees of unobstructed space. When you stood on that deck, you could see the Tarakan Nebula on the left and the edge of disputed Zone 7 on the right, and both of them glittered like something out of a mythology. The ship was carrying 412 passengers on the night of the Accords, representatives from 17 species, ambassadors, generals, analysts, translators, military escorts, personal staff. The coalition had spared no expense. There were catering units running 36 hours straight, translation matrices installed at every junction, environmental controls calibrated separately for 12 different atmospheric preferences. It was, in every measurable way, the most significant diplomatic event since the end of the Vetheran Purge. The Tarakan Accords were supposed to formalize a mutual defense agreement between 8 of the coalition's primary military powers. If it worked, it was going to fundamentally reshape the balance of power in the Outer Rim. If it failed, and there were people on board who very much wanted it to fail, the consequences were too ugly to fully model. I was there as a secondary analyst for the Coalition Bureau. My job was to watch, to document, to notice the things that nobody else was supposed to notice. And the most unremarkable thing in the entire room, by every outward measure, was the human aide standing behind General Sova Ren. General Sova Ren of the Kethali Empire. If you've never encountered a Kethali in person, I'll do my best, but I should warn you, language isn't really adequate for what they are. The Kethali evolved on a high-gravity world in the Arson cluster, which means they're built differently from most bipedal species. Taller, denser. The musculature runs in overlapping layers, and their bone structure is reinforced in ways that make human anatomy look almost provisional by comparison. Sova Ren stood at nearly 2.5 meters. Her skin was the color of dark volcanic stone, streaked through with those bioluminescent filaments that Kethali develop as they age and accumulate rank. Thin lines of cold blue light that run along the neck, the temples, the backs of the hands. She was 47 years old, which in Kethali terms means she was at the absolute peak of her physical and mental capacities. She had commanded fleets. She had prosecuted 3 separate military campaigns. She had, by her own documented account, personally ended the careers of 6 different Kethali generals who had questioned her judgment. She was terrifying in the way that only genuinely competent people can be terrifying. And she moved through the Velorath's diplomatic chambers like she owned them, which, given the size of the Kethali military contribution to the Accords, she arguably did. Her entourage was exactly what you'd expect. 4 Kethali honor guard, each armed with resonance lances and wearing ceremonial combat plates. 2 Kethali diplomatic advisors in the gray sash of the Imperial Bureau. 1 Kethali communications specialist carrying a signal array that probably cost more than my annual salary. And then, 3 steps behind all of them, slightly off to the left, carrying a data pad in one hand and what appeared to be a thermal container in the other. Marcus Elian Croft. Human, male. Somewhere in his mid-30s, though with humans it's always hard to tell. Medium height, which put him somewhere around 1.80 m. Not particularly built, not particularly striking. Dark hair, a little longer than strictly regulation, slightly curling at the temples. Eyes that caught light in a way I noticed but couldn't immediately explain, a kind of pale gray-green that seemed almost mismatched with the blandness of the rest of his presentation. He was wearing a standard coalition Aide uniform, dark charcoal gray, minimal insignia, the small silver pin of a secondary-class administrative attachment. Nothing that said, "Look at me." Everything that said, "I'm just here to carry things." And I'll tell you honestly, when I first cataloged the Wren entourage during my pre-event documentation sweep, I logged him as one ex-human administrative aide, no independent security flag, no noted diplomatic function. I didn't even write his name down. I had to go back and find it afterward from the ship's crew manifest. That's how invisible he was. That's how invisible he was supposed to be. The first session of the Accords began at 1800 ship standard. The main chamber was the Velorath's diplomatic hall, a vast, circular room with a tiered floor that descended to a central discussion table. The environmental engineers had split the room into atmospheric zones using invisible force membrane partitions, which is harder to do than it sounds and almost never works perfectly. There was a faint tang in the air around the Kethali section that I suspected was atmosphere bleed from the Myrathi delegation on the other side, whose preferred breathing mix has a slight sulfur component. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody was going to mention it. General Wren took her seat at the primary Kethali position with the casual authority of someone sitting on a throne they've owned for 100 years. Her advisors arranged themselves on either side. The honor guard took their positions at the rear. Croft found a spot along the far wall next to a service console and stood there. He didn't sit. There weren't chairs for aides. He set the thermal container on the console ledge, tucked the data pad under his arm, and just stood, watching. The way aides watch things, not really engaged, not really absent, present in the room but not of it. I watched him for maybe 30 seconds at the start, and then my attention went to the table, where the actual politics were happening. The Myrathi ambassador was raising an objection about the treaty's third clause regarding resource extraction rights in the newly demilitarized zones. The Velkin delegation was counter-proposing an amendment that the Kethali advisors were already flagging as unacceptable. The Drekari representative, and the Drekari are a species that communicate primarily through pheromonal signaling, which always makes their translated speech sound slightly delayed and oddly flat, was requesting clarification on a subsection that I was pretty sure had been deliberately written to be unclear. Standard diplomatic chaos, in other words. I was running documentation on 3 separate feeds and trying to maintain eye contact with 2 informants in the room simultaneously. Croft was irrelevant. The first session ran 4 hours. It ended without resolution on the third clause, which surprised no one. The delegations dispersed to their assigned quarters for the overnight rest period, and the observation deck opened for informal networking, which is coalition diplomatic code for everyone goes up there and says the things they can't say at the table. I went up to the observation deck because that's where the real conversations happen. I've learned more from 3 hours of informal networking than from 3 days of formal sessions, and I've got the archive files to prove it. The deck was, I keep coming back to this word, but it's the right one, beautiful. The Tarakan Nebula was positioned almost directly ahead, close enough that its light gave everything a warm amber wash. You could see individual gas filaments in the outer bands, these long, slow-curling structures that looked like they were breathing. The stars beyond it were thick. We were at the rim of a particularly dense cluster, and there were so many of them that the darkness between them felt almost incidental. People drifted in clusters, the way they always do at these things. Species gravitating toward species, subdelegations finding quiet corners with rival subdelegations, translators hovering at the edges of multiple conversations simultaneously. Wine was being served, a coalition-neutral blend that tastes like nothing in particular, which is specifically designed so that no single species finds it either appealing or offensive. I saw General Wren almost immediately, because Kethali are impossible to miss, and she was, by far, the most significant military figure in the room. She was talking to Admiral Dusketh of the Myrathi fleet, a conversation I badly wanted to hear but couldn't get close enough to without it being obvious. Croft was with her, 3 steps back, holding the data pad. I found a position near the Velkin diplomatic cluster. They're a useful cover because they tend to have their own very loud conversations that justify a nearby presence, and I started working the room in my head, deciding who to approach first. And that's when I saw the first thing. It was small, it would have meant nothing to most people. One of the Kethali honor guard, a big one, even by Kethali standards, with a formal scar pattern across the right cheek that indicated at least 2 confirmed kills in ritual combat, stepped away from his position to pick up a communication from his personal relay. His back was to the general for maybe 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, a Drekari attaché, a young one, junior ranking, who'd been drifting around the room in a way that I'd logged as slightly too purposeful for casual networking, moved within 6 meters of General Wren. Now 6 meters is not close. 6 meters is across a room. In a crowded diplomatic reception, 6 meters is nothing. People drift to 6 meters of each other constantly. But Croft's data pad came up. Not dramatically. Not in a way you'd notice unless you were already watching him. He just raised the pad a few centimeters, and his eyes moved, so briefly, so precisely, from the Drekari attaché to the gap left by the honor guard, and then back to the Drekari attaché. And he shifted his position 2 steps to the left. He was now between the Drekari attaché and a direct sightline to General Wren's left side. The Drekari attaché slowed, did some very natural-looking looking at the nebula, then drifted in a different direction. The honor guard came back to his position. Croft returned to exactly where he'd been standing before. The whole thing took maybe 90 seconds. If I hadn't been in the business of watching rooms for 2 decades, I'd have missed it completely. And even having seen it, I told myself, probably coincidence, probably an aide who happened to move and it happened to put him in a useful position. I noted it, I moved on. I talked to 3 Velkin subdelegates about the 3rd clause dispute. I caught half of a conversation between 2 Myrathi admirals about fuel depot access rights. I made mental notes about which coalition representatives seemed to be sleeping less than they should be. When I left the observation deck at 100 ship standard, Croft was still there, standing in his spot, holding his data pad, watching the room. I don't know if he ever sat down that night. I don't know if he ever ate anything. I didn't see him drink anything. I noted that too. The second session began at 900 the next morning, and it was immediately more contentious than the first. The 3rd clause was still unresolved, and the Drekari had introduced a new proposed amendment that the Kethali delegation found. And I'm using the Kethali diplomatic advisor's translated words here, structurally offensive to the principle of sovereign military authority, which in practical terms meant they hated it and weren't going to negotiate on it. Wren herself didn't speak much in these sessions. That's actually a mark of powerful delegation, when your advisors can carry the argument and you only speak to end the argument. She sat at the primary seat with the stillness that I associated with Kethali at their most focused, and she listened, and occasionally one of her advisors would lean toward her and she would give some microscopic response. A slight tilt of the head, a fractional adjustment of her expression, and the advisor would take that back to the table. Croft sat in the aide gallery on the far side of the chamber. The aide gallery was a narrow bench area separated from the main floor by a low partition, specifically designed to give aides a sightline without them being visually present in the formal session space. There were maybe 30 aides in there across all delegations, various species, various uniforms, various degrees of engagement with the proceedings. Croft was at one end of the bench. He didn't slouch. He didn't look at his data pad the whole time, the way most of the aides did. He watched the room with that same quality of attention I'd noticed on the observation deck, present, focused, not visually arresting but somehow very alert. At 10:34, there was an incident. One of the translation matrices failed. Not catastrophically. The room didn't go dark or anything dramatic. But the Drekari's translation feed cut out for about 40 seconds. And in those 40 seconds, the Drekari representative made what his delegation later described as an informal observation regarding Kethali military doctrine. and what the Kethali delegation described as a serious provocation that would require formal redress. The room went tense in that very specific diplomatic way, where nothing visibly changes, but every person in it suddenly becomes extremely aware of how many other people are in it, and what all of them are capable of. The coalition mediator, a Velkin named Coordinator Usen Hull, moved to restore the matrix and clarify the communication. Professional, calm, exactly trained for this. What I was watching was the Kethali Honor Guard. They moved, not dramatically, not weapon drawing, but the subtle realignment of 4 very large trained warriors who have just perceived a threat to their principal, weight shifting forward, hands dropping to resting positions closer to their weapons, eyes doing the rapid multi-point scan that means someone's threat assessment protocol just activated. The Kethali diplomatic advisors were looking at Ren. Ren's expression hadn't changed, but the bioluminescent filaments on her temples had brightened very slightly, which I knew from briefings was an involuntary stress response in Kethali physiology. This was the moment when something stupid could happen. And then Croft was up. Not running, not rushing. He stood from the aide bench in one smooth motion, crossed to the aide floor partition, and spoke quietly to one of the Kethali Honor Guard, the same large one from the observation deck the night before. I couldn't hear what he said. I was too far away, and the room's ambient noise had risen with the tension. Whatever he said, the Honor Guard's weight shifted back. The warrior's head turned to Croft, and then turned to Ren, and something passed between them. The guard made a very small hand gesture toward the general, which in Kethali military signaling I later confirmed is a code for principal status. Stable hold position. The other 3 guard followed the lead of the first. The translation matrix came back online. The Drakari offered a formal clarification. The Kethali advisors accepted it as sufficient. The moment passed. Croft returned to the aide bench. I looked around the room to see if anyone else had noticed what had just happened. The other aides were focused on their data pads. The secondary analysts on my tier were watching the mediator. The junior coalition staffers were documenting the matrix failure. Nobody had seen it. Nobody except me. I looked at my notes. I underlined what I'd written about the observation deck. I added a new line. Who is this man? I ran a query on Marcus Elian Croft during the lunch recess. Standard procedure when you flagged someone for further attention. Pull their coalition file, cross-reference their security clearance, check their assignment history. The file came back in about 3 minutes. And it was fine. It was perfectly fine. A little thin, maybe. Croft had been assigned to the Kethali diplomatic liaison office 11 months prior, following a 12-year tenure in the coalition's administrative corps. His record was clean, no disciplinary flags, no security incidents, a series of competent to good performance evaluations from various supervisors. He'd apparently worked in 3 different departments before the liaison office, including a stint in supply chain logistics and another in field communications support. Nothing remarkable, nothing alarming, nothing that said anything other than reliable mid-level administrative professional. His coalition clearance was standard for aide-class positions. Access to non-classified session materials, no independent intelligence authorization, no weapons carry permit in diplomatic spaces. He had 2 emergency contacts listed. Both had different last names, which suggested he wasn't close to family or had chosen not to involve them. His physical stats were on file for standard coalition medical purposes. 183 centimeters, 84 kilograms, blood type that I won't bore you with, one notable entry. A field medical notation from 7 years ago indicating trauma presentation, orthopedic, that had resulted in a 3-month recovery period. The notation didn't say what caused the trauma. I ran a supplementary search on his pre-coalition background. The standard procedure is a 10-year look-back, and got a wall. Not a soft wall, the kind you get when records are lost or disorganized. A hard wall, the kind that means the records are there but access is restricted. Not coalition restricted. The notation said, restricted external authority. I'd seen that notation before. Twice. Both times it had indicated a subject with a prior affiliation to an organization that existed outside the coalition's jurisdiction and chose, to maintain operational security over its personnel records, even after those personnel had officially transitioned to civilian or diplomatic life. I sat with that for a moment. Then I went back to the session. The afternoon session introduced a new complication. A Velkin subdelegation member, Junior, probably on his third or fourth posting, looked like he was trying very hard to seem more experienced than he was, raised what he characterized as a procedural concern about the military authority structures outlined in the Accord's appendix section. It was a valid concern. It was also, very obviously, a concern that had been raised at the behest of someone more senior who didn't want to be seen raising it directly. That's basic diplomatic choreography, and everyone in the room knew it. The interesting question was who'd given him the script. General Wren was paying attention to this. I could tell because the bioluminescent filaments had shifted from cold blue to something slightly warmer, which in the briefing notes I'd read indicated active engagement rather than passive monitoring. She was interested in this Velkin subdelegate. She wanted to know the same thing I wanted to know. Croft noticed it too. I saw him look at Wren, not the extended kind of look you could call staring, just a brief check, and then his eyes moved to the Velkin junior delegate, and then to the senior Velkin ambassador, and I swear to you there was a moment where I saw him work something out. His jaw did this very small thing, not quite a tightening, more a subtle acknowledgement, and then he made a note on his data pad. During the next break, I watched him find a moment to position himself near one of the Kethali diplomatic advisors and exchange approximately 40 words. The advisor then leaned toward Wren and spoke to her quietly. Wren's expression did something very small. She glanced at the Velkin senior ambassador across the room, and something passed behind her eyes. She now knew where the concern had originated, which meant she could decide how to address it, or more precisely, whether it needed addressing at all, or whether it was better handled by leaving it alone and noting who'd asked it. The Velkin junior delegate had no idea he'd just been assessed, categorized, and filed. I don't think Croft was supposed to be doing this. That's the thing. This was well beyond the scope of an aide's function. Aides carry things. Aides maintain schedules. Aides do not run quiet political analysis in diplomatic sessions and feed it up to generals. Unless they do, unless that's exactly what some aides are. On the third night, the observation deck was less crowded. The first 2 days had been about showing presence, making sure everyone saw everyone, established who was in the room. By the third night, the serious people were having serious conversations in private quarters, and the deck was mainly used by the delegations that wanted to seem accessible. Wren came up late, past midnight ship standard, with only 2 of her guard and 1 advisor. The networking fiction was long gone. She came up because the nebula was there, and I think, in her way, she found it useful to look at something vast and indifferent when she was working through a problem. Croft was with her, of course he was. I was on the deck because I'd had a feeling, and I'd learned to trust feelings. I was near the far end, positioned behind a group of junior Myrathi staffers who were genuinely stargazing and gave me natural cover. At about 1:15, a delegation I hadn't expected appeared on the observation deck. The Tarakan Collective. Now the Tarakan Collective weren't signatories to the Accords. They were observers. In theory, they had no stake in the outcome. In practice, the Collective's resource corridors ran through 2 of the disputed zones that the Accords were attempting to formalize, which meant they had every stake in the outcome, and were simply choosing not to show it officially. Their lead representative was a being named Sorvith Mal. The Tarakan are a species I find genuinely difficult to describe without defaulting to intimidating language, but I'll try to be precise. They're large, about Kethali height, with a body plan that emphasizes upper body mass and a natural exoskeleton that covers the shoulders, chest, and upper arms. Their faces are relatively humanoid, which is actually more unsettling than something entirely alien would be. They look almost like someone's blurred memory of a person. Mal was their chief political operative, which in Tarakan culture is a role that combines what humans would call ambassador, intelligence director, and executive enforcer. He was not supposed to be there. Not technically, the deck was open to all registered observers, but in the understood choreography of the event, the Tarakan didn't engage directly with the primary military delegations outside of formal sessions. He walked directly toward General Wren. I moved. I came around the Mirathi group to get a closer position. I was maybe 20 meters away when Maul reached Ren. I couldn't hear everything. Ship ventilation systems create ambient noise, and this end of the deck had a stronger current than the center. But I caught fragments. Maul was talking about the third clause. His tone was not threatening, but weighted. The kind of weighted that only sounds like conversation if you're not listening carefully. He was making a point about what the collective could offer if the Accord's military structures were modified in a specific way, and what the collective could, alternatively, do if they weren't. Ren was listening with the stillness she always had, but something was off. One of her guard had moved up slightly, not into confrontation stance, but closer than standard escort position. The advisor had taken a step back, creating space. These were defensive microadjustments, the kind that happen when the principal is unsettled but doesn't want to show it. I thought, this is a pressure conversation. Maul is applying pressure. He knows something that puts Ren in an uncomfortable position, and he's using it. And then Croft moved. Not to Ren's side, not where you'd expect an aide to move. He moved to a position between Maul's left flank and the observation deck railing. It was a subtle repositioning, and from Maul's perspective it would have read as nothing, an aide drifting into a different spot to look at the nebula. But from my angle, I could see what he'd actually done. He'd blocked Maul's exit path on that side. The Cathali guard had moved up on the right. Between Croft's new position, the guard, and the railing, there were now only two ways for Maul to leave the immediate area, back through the main deck crowd, or directly past Ren. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't aggressive, it was tactical. Maul noticed it approximately 4 seconds after I did. I saw his eyes move to Croft, the kind of eyes moving that you see on people who have spent their professional lives in rooms where the geometry of exits matters, and something shifted in his posture. Very slightly, almost imperceptibly. But it shifted. He wrapped up his conversation with Ren in about 45 more seconds. Formally polite, appropriate farewells, the whole diplomatic pantomime. And then he went back through the main crowd. When he was 30 meters away, Croft returned to his position behind Ren. Ren said something to him without looking at him. It was 3 words in translated Cathali, and I only caught one of them because the ventilation current shifted in that moment. The one word I caught was their word for good. I sent an urgent query to my bureau chief that night. I laid out what I'd observed, the positioning on the deck, the honor guard communication during the Matrix incident, the intelligence feed to the Cathali advisor, the geometry play with Maul. I included the wall I'd hit on Croft's pre-coalition records, the external authority restriction, the medical trauma notation from 7 years ago. I asked for a full background pull, highest access level I could justify, and I added a personal note. I think we need to know who this man actually is before this event goes any further. The response came back at 500 ship standard, faster than I expected, which meant my bureau chief had read my query immediately and hadn't slept on it. The response had 2 parts. The first part said, query forwarded to special records, awaiting authorization chain. The second part said, analyst des, exercise extreme caution. Do not approach the subject. Do not flag the subject to any member of his delegation or the host delegation. Do not document further observations outside of Bureau Secure Channel. This instruction supersedes standard protocol. Bureau Director Yale Kovac. I read that twice. Bureau Director Kovac didn't personally send messages to field analysts. That was not how the chain worked, at all. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I put my data pad face down on the cabin desk, lay back on the bunk, and spent the next 2 hours staring at the ceiling. Don't approach, don't flag. Don't document outside secure channel. Those aren't instructions you give someone when you don't know who you're dealing with. Those are instructions you give when you know exactly who you're dealing with, and you're very, very careful about it. I've been thinking about how to explain what happened over the next 36 hours without making it sound like I was paranoid or professionally compromised, because I know how it can read. Analyst gets curious about a nobody, runs a query, gets a cryptic response from the director, starts seeing patterns everywhere. I know what that looks like. I also know what I know. And what I knew by day 4 of the Accords was that Marcus Elian Croft was operating on a level of awareness that didn't match his file, his uniform, his clearance, or anything else about his official presentation. And that someone senior enough to make the bureau director personally intervene was aware of this and chose, very specifically, to neither confirm nor deny it to me. That choice, the choice not to tell me, meant one of two things. Either Croft was an ongoing asset of a friendly intelligence organization, and his cover needed to be maintained for operational reasons, or the situation around him was sensitive enough that they didn't trust a secondary field analyst with the information. Given the director's personal involvement, I suspected both. Day 4 began with a technical problem. The Velorath's secondary communications array had been experiencing interference since 300, intermittent, low-level, the kind that typically indicates an equipment issue rather than active jamming. The ship's engineering team had been working on it through the night watch and had apparently identified the source as a degraded relay node in the outer array housing. This was announced at the morning briefing as a minor technical matter that would be resolved before the day's sessions began. Standard reassurance. I paid attention to it because interference patterns are interesting to me professionally. The kind of interference described, intermittent, low-level, source attributed to hardware, can sometimes also be the signature of a very sophisticated jamming protocol designed to look like hardware failure. The ship's engineers were very good, and I trusted their assessment. But very sophisticated doesn't preclude the engineers being wrong. I kept it in the back of my mind. The morning session went smoothly, which is always slightly suspicious in my experience. When contentious negotiations suddenly go smoothly, it usually means one of two things. Either a resolution has been quietly prearranged, or someone is holding their fire. The Drekari withdrew their problematic amendment. The Cathali advisors accepted the withdrawal without pressing for further concessions, which was more generous than they needed to be. The Velkin coordinator proposed a modified version of the third clause language that addressed the primary Cathali objection, and the room received it as, if not a victory, at least a viable foundation. It felt like progress. It felt like the accords might actually work. Wren sat through the session with the expression of someone who has seen too many negotiations go wrong to celebrate yet. Her bioluminescent filaments were at their standard resting brightness, cool, steady, non-reactive. She looked like a very large, very patient person who was doing advanced arithmetic in her head while other people talked. Croft was in the Aide gallery. He hadn't eaten anything again, as far as I could see. During the midday recess, I watched him do something that I'd been subconsciously waiting for him to do since day one. He left Wren's immediate proximity. Just briefly, he crossed the diplomatic hall to the Aide service station, a small area where the support staff could access refreshment units and check their communications, and he stood there for about 4 minutes, his back mostly to the room. I couldn't see what he was doing, but the communications officer who was using the station at the same time, a young coalition staffer, female, human, early 20s, moved away from the station after about 90 seconds with the very distinctive body language of someone who has just been told something that has mildly frightened them. She didn't run. She didn't make a scene. She simply gathered her things and went to the other side of the room and found a reason to stay there. I watched Croft finish whatever he was doing at the station, pick up something from the refreshment unit. I never saw him eat it, but he did take it, and return to his position with Wren's delegation. I went to the service station during the next opportunity I had. The communications console in that station had a standard interface, nothing unusual, nothing obviously modified. But the log showed a brief 6-second access during the recess window, not logged to any registered user. 6 seconds is not enough time to send a conventional message. It is enough time to deploy a burst transmission packet if you have one preloaded, and the access codes to release it through the ship's array. The compromised secondary array that had been experiencing interference since 300. I noted it in my secure channel log and added it to the pattern. Not a combat alarm, not an evacuation order, a security alert, the low-frequency pulse that means something has been detected that requires investigation without triggering a full response. The kind of alarm that's designed to activate security personnel without causing panic in the general population. I heard it through my earpiece, which was tuned to the ship's security channel. The general population of the Velorath didn't hear it at all. I was in the outer corridor near the diplomatic hall when it went off. I moved toward the security feed. My clearance allowed me access to the primary feed terminals and pulled up the incident report. A small device had been found in the secondary atmospheric control junction on sublevel 3. The discovery had been made by an engineering technician doing routine maintenance following the morning's interference report. The device was, according to the preliminary technical assessment, a chemical dispersal unit, specifically a microcapsule delivery system designed to release a compound into the atmospheric circulation of a targeted environmental zone. The preliminary compound identification showed a partial match with a class of materials used in, and I'm quoting the technical report here, incapacitation applications against species with Cathali-adjacent physiology. Not lethal, incapacitation, targeted specifically to Cathali biology, which meant it would have put General Sova Wren on the floor without touching anyone else in the room. The engineering technician had found it because he was doing follow-up work on the interference problem. The interference that had drawn attention to the secondary array housing, the attention that had prompted additional checks in adjacent systems. The interference that Croft had potentially, I was still working this out, the interference that someone may have needed to exist in order for that junction to be checked. I stood in the corridor for a moment and let the logic sit. If Croft had created the interference, generated it deliberately, through that 6-second access at the service station, using a preloaded burst transmission, then he'd done it specifically to ensure the engineering team ran additional checks on sublevel systems, which would lead to the discovery of the dispersal unit before the evening's formal reception, where it would presumably have been triggered. He'd found the device by creating the condition for its discovery without ever going near it himself or flagging it to security directly. Which meant he'd known about it before it was found. Which meant he'd known about it before it was placed. Who is this man? Security locked down sublevel 3. The device was removed by the ship's EOD team. Formal notification went to the senior security officer, who made a quiet assessment and determined, correctly, that informing the delegations would be more destabilizing than the current level of contained response warranted. Nobody in the diplomatic sessions knew. Nobody except I was increasingly certain Croft. He returned to his position behind Wren at 1600, with 2 minutes before the afternoon session began. He was carrying the data pad and the thermal container. He looked exactly as he always looked, slightly too alert, slightly too still, entirely unremarkable. Wren said something to him as he took his position. He responded without looking up from the pad. She made a very small sound, not quite a laugh, more an exhale that carried something like acknowledgement, and turned back to the table. I had been watching her interact with him for 4 days, and I had never once seen her look at him the way she'd look at someone she considered important. She spoke to him the way you speak to someone who is functionally part of the furniture, present, useful, not requiring eye contact or formal acknowledgement. She had no idea. She genuinely, demonstrably had no idea that the man 3 steps behind her had, in the past 4 days, quietly blocked at least one pressure approach from a major collective operative, fed her political intelligence she hadn't asked for and wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and almost certainly prevented a chemical incapacitation event that would have put her on the floor of a diplomatic reception in front of every major military power in the Outer Rim. She thought he was carrying her coffee. The formal reception on the 4th evening was supposed to be the ceremonial high point of the Accords. A coalition tradition, the signing parties gather in a less formal setting, share a meal or its species-appropriate equivalent, and create the conditions for the final session to feel like a natural conclusion rather than a negotiated standstill. The observation deck was reconfigured, atmospheric zones adjusted, catering units running the full species-specific menu rotation. Someone had arranged for the lighting to shift toward a warmer spectrum during the evening, which gave the whole deck a quality I can only describe as intentionally significant, like the light itself was aware that things were happening underneath it. Wren arrived early, which I noted because arriving early at a social event is not something powerful Cathali generals typically do. Arriving early means you care about the event, You're not supposed to care about the event. You're supposed to be above it. She walked the full circumference of the deck once, slowly, with her two guards and Croft, not looking at the nebula, looking at the room, the setup, the access points, the other delegations coming in behind her. She was uneasy. I didn't know why yet. Croft walked the circumference with her. His eyes did the same sweep hers did, but faster, like he was confirming something he'd already half-processed, running a check against an internal map that was more detailed than the one he needed for carrying a data pad. After the circuit, he stopped her, or rather, said something that made her stop, at a position near the curve of the far wall. They stood there for a moment, and I saw him gesture very slightly with the data pad toward the main entrance cluster. Ren looked, I looked. The Tarakan delegation was coming in larger than expected. Maul was there with his standard 2 attendants, which was normal. But there were 4 additional Tarakan figures entering behind them, not in collective diplomatic designation, not in observer robes. They were wearing something else, something that wasn't quite a uniform but had the structure of one. And they were big. Even by Tarakan standards, they were big. I pulled my data pad and ran an immediate check on the Velorath's registered guest manifest. Those 4 figures weren't on it. The next 14 minutes were the most controlled, the most precise, and the most quietly terrifying thing I have ever witnessed in a professional career that has included several things I previously considered to be the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. Croft did not panic. He spoke to Ren, 3 sentences. Her bioluminescent filaments went to their warmest shade, active high engagement, slightly stressed, and then steadied. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and walked toward the Myrathi admiral to begin a conversation that was very clearly designed to keep her in a specific position while placing the Kethali guard in naturally occurring adjacency to their principal. Croft did the opposite. He went toward the Tarakan group. Not directly. He approached the service station on that end of the deck, a plausible reason for an aide to be moving, the service station, getting something, and then he was simply nearby. He had a drink unit in his hand. He was looking at the nebula. The 4 unregistered Tarakan figures had fanned out. 2 moved right, toward the edge of the Kethali delegation cluster. 2 moved left, toward the area where the Coalition Mediators group was standing. They were positioning. I didn't know for what yet, but they were positioning. I hit my emergency channel to ship security. I flagged 4 unregistered individuals on the observation deck, possible hostile positioning, urgent response requested. The response came back, acknowledged 3 minutes for security deployment. 3 minutes is a long time. Croft had none of my resources, and I'm not sure he needed them. I watched him clock the positions of all 4 figures in approximately 8 seconds. One long, slow, apparently casual look around the deck that covered the room the way a camera covers a room, smooth and comprehensive. And then he turned back to the service station and set down the drink unit. And when he turned back around to face the deck, something had changed about him. I don't know how to explain this accurately without sounding like I'm being dramatic, so I'll just say it plainly and let you decide. The quality of his presence changed. The best comparison I can give you is this. You know how you can be in a room with someone for a long time and they're just part of the background, part of the furniture, and then something happens. They stand differently, or they look at you differently, or they stop doing the small social performances that everyone does constantly to signal I am ordinary, I am safe, I am not a threat, and suddenly you're aware of them in a completely different way. That, whatever performance Croft had been running, and I realized in that moment that it had been a performance, a carefully maintained presentation of ordinariness. He stopped running it. He stood at the service station end of the observation deck with a drink unit in his hand, and he looked at the 4 Tarakan figures, and the 4 Tarakan figures looked at him, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with diplomatic courtesy or aid function or anything else that the official record of the Velorath's 4th evening would ever contain. One of the Tarakan figures, the one positioned closest to the Kethali cluster, stopped moving. Just stopped. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to reconstruct exactly what signals the Tarakan operatives were reading when they looked at Croft. The Tarakan collective security apparatus is sophisticated. I don't have full intelligence on their operative training, but I know they recruit from military backgrounds. I know their field agents go through extensive evaluation. And I know they are not people who stop moving based on nothing. They stopped moving based on something. The most coherent reconstruction I've been able to make, and this is partially speculation, I'll be honest, is that what they were reading in Croft's posture, his positioning, the sudden absence of his ordinary person performance was recognition. The recognition of what he was, or had been. Because here's the thing. The Tarakan Collective is a large organization. They've operated in the Outer Rim for a long time. They have deep intelligence networks and extensive operational histories. And there are certain names, certain designations, certain organizational indicators that appear in their intelligence files specifically because those files were compiled as threat assessments. I believe what the Tarakan operatives recognized when Croft stopped performing and simply stood there was a threat assessment made flesh. A name from a file, suddenly in a room looking at them. The term I eventually found in the classified briefings I was granted access to, much later, after everything was over and the formal inquiry had closed, was Reaper class. It's a designation, not a name. A classification used by 3 separate non-coalition intelligence organizations to categorize a very specific type of operative, one trained in. And I'm summarizing a very long document here. Covert elimination, counterintelligence operations, political destabilization response, and what the document calls decisive intervention under high-risk diplomatic conditions. Reaper-class operatives are not common. They're not supposed to exist publicly. They're trained to be invisible not just to civilians, but to other professionals, to security services, to people whose entire job is to notice things. The entire point of the Reaper designation, from what I read, is that you should never know one is in the room until the moment they decide you should know. Croft had decided the Tarakan operatives should know. He'd done it deliberately. He'd turned it on like a switch. And they'd read it. All 4 of them had read it. The one nearest the Cathali cluster had stopped moving. The 2 near the mediators group were looking at each other with the particular quality of eye contact that means what do we do? The 4th one, who'd positioned near the main entrance, was now angled away from the room in the posture of someone who is recalculating. Maul was watching from his position with the collective's official delegates. His expression was, for the first time in 4 days, something other than controlled. He was watching Croft, just Croft. The way you look at something you'd mentally filed as irrelevant and have just realized is not. Ship security arrived in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I had the timestamps from my channel. They were quiet about it, 6 security officers in standard patrol configuration, coming through 3 different deck access points so it didn't look like a response, looked like a rotation. Professional, well-drilled. The 4 unregistered Tarakan figures did not resist, did not argue, did not do anything except, when approached by the security team and politely asked to provide their registration credentials, produce what turned out to be legitimate temporary observer passes that collective administrative staff had quietly added to the manifest at some point in the past 12 hours. Legitimate passes, which meant security could ask them to step away from the primary delegation cluster for verification purposes, but couldn't detain them. They were escorted to a secondary area. The situation was, on paper, a routine document verification. Maul watched this happen. When the last of his unregistered operatives was moved away from the primary floor, he looked again at Croft, one long look, very direct, without any of the surface-level diplomatic warmth he'd deployed in the room all week, and Croft looked back at him. I don't know what passed between them in that look. I don't know what language it was in, what the grammar of it was, what it felt like to be one of the people in it. What I can tell you is that when it ended, Maul left the observation deck. His entire official delegation followed him 12 minutes later, citing a scheduled communications review. They did not return for the evening's reception. The Tarakan Collective announced their withdrawal from observer status the following morning. General Sova Wren, when the situation with the unregistered figures resolved, did not rush to Croft. She didn't make a scene. She finished her conversation with the Myrathi admiral, finished it properly with the appropriate diplomatic conclusions, and then moved back to her standard position. Croft was waiting at the 3 steps back location. She said something to him, 6 words, maybe 7. I was close enough by then, I'd moved after the security deployment, to almost hear it, but the ventilation current was against me. He responded, one word, yes, I think, or the Cathali equivalent she apparently expected him to use. She turned away. She returned her attention to the room. But in the moment she turned, in the 2 seconds between looking at him and looking away, I saw something cross her face that I don't have a precise name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't surprise, because I think on some level she'd known she was carrying something that was more than it looked. It was something closer to reassessment. The expression of a person who has just recalibrated a long-held assumption and isn't sure yet what to do with the recalibration. She had thought he was nobody. She was no longer sure about that. The 5th day was the last day of formal sessions. The modified third clause was formally approved. The appendix authority structures were amended per the Velkin coordinator's proposal. 7 of the 8 primary signatories confirmed their adhesion. The 8th, a Drekari subcommander who'd been clearly uncomfortable all week, requested an additional 48 hours before signing, which was granted, and who eventually signed remotely from their ship's communications suite about 3 days later. By all measures, the Tarakan Accords were a success. The Tarakan Collective's withdrawal from observer status was noted in the formal record as observer reassessment following internal review. Nobody in the official record mentioned the 4 unregistered figures. Nobody mentioned the chemical dispersal device found in sublevel 3, which was listed in the ship's internal incident log under equipment inspection, anomalous finding, and left there. Nobody mentioned the interference pattern, the burst transmission, the service station access log. The formal record of the Tarakan Accords, as it stands in the Coalition archive, is a clean document. Successful negotiation, professional diplomatic conduct, measured outcome achieved. That's the document that historians will read. I was there. There's one more thing I need to tell you, and this is the part I've sat with the longest. On the morning of the 5th day, before the final session, I was in the lower corridor outside the dining facility when I saw Croft come around the corner alone. No data pad, no thermal container. For the first time in 5 days, he wasn't carrying anything. He was walking with his hands at his sides, and he looked tired. Not the tired of someone who hasn't slept, though I don't think he'd slept much. The tired of someone who has been very tightly controlled for a long time and has allowed themselves, in a corridor they believe to be empty, to stop being controlled. He wasn't performing ordinary. He was just a man walking down a corridor, and there was something in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his expression that was, in the most precise sense I can find, heavy. I didn't follow the director's instruction. I'm going to be transparent about that. I spoke to him. I said his name, just his first name, Marcus, and he stopped. His eyes came to me in a fraction of a second, and for that fraction I saw what the Tarakan operatives had seen. The absence of performance, the real thing underneath. Then it closed. He looked at me with exactly the expression a competent mid-level aide would use when addressed by a coalition analyst he didn't recognize. "Can I help you?" he said. Professional, polite, completely opaque. I said, "I'm with the Bureau. I've been watching this week." A pause, he said, "I see." I said, "You don't have to confirm anything. I just wanted you to know that someone saw." He looked at me for a moment. I couldn't read the look. It was too carefully constructed. Or maybe it wasn't constructed at all. Maybe it was just genuinely private. Then he said, "How's the third clause looking?" And I almost laughed, because it was such a perfect pivot, not a deflection, exactly, not an evasion, just a redirect back to the only thing that mattered in the official space we were both nominally occupying. The accords, the clause, the work. I said I thought it looked solid. He said he thought so too. We stood in the corridor for about 10 seconds. Then he nodded, a brief, precise nod, the kind that closes something without slamming it, and continued down the corridor. I watched him go. He turned the corner, and I never saw Marcus Elian Croft again. Part 5, what came after? The inquiry. There's always an inquiry after events like this. The Coalition Bureau runs a standard post-event review, pulling incident reports, cross-referencing analyst logs, assessing what was known and when and whether appropriate responses were made. The Sublevel 3 device was reviewed. The Tarakan Collective was formally notified that their observer credentials had included irregularly documented personnel, and their response was a diplomatic apology and an internal review that, surprise, found nothing actionable. My logs were reviewed. My bureau chief reviewed them personally. The director's communication to me, the one that was abnormally direct, the one ordering extreme caution regarding Croft, was flagged in the review and subsequently reclassified. I was told it fell under a joint operational security protocol that I didn't have access to. I was asked, in my post-event interview, whether I had maintained appropriate professional distance from all non-coalition personnel during the event. I said yes. This was not entirely accurate, and I have lived with that small inaccuracy for the years since, and I find it doesn't trouble me much. What troubles me, in the way that things you can't fully explain always trouble you, is something more specific. 6 months after the Accords, I was in a bureau archive running a historical pull on Reaper-class designations, which I was now authorized to access, following a clearance upgrade that I believe was related to the Accords review. The archive was substantial. The designation had a 40-year history. There were 17 confirmed Reaper-class operatives in the full record. 14 of them were listed as inactive, retired, deceased, or status unknown. 2 were listed as active in current assignments. 1 was listed as status, voluntarily transitioned. Current location, Coalition Diplomatic Liaison Corps, Cathali Department. Assignment, Personal Aide, General Sovereign. I sat with that entry for a long time. Voluntarily transitioned. He'd chosen it. Whatever he'd been before, whatever the Tarakan Collective had read in him on the observation deck, whatever the bureau director had been so carefully not saying, whatever put that heaviness in his shoulders in the empty corridor, he'd chosen to leave it behind and carry data pads for a Cathali general who didn't know his name. I don't know why. I have guesses. People who do that kind of work for long enough sometimes need to stop, need to be somewhere that is still useful but quieter, still necessary but not continuously at the absolute edge of what it's possible to do without losing yourself. And maybe he'd found, in the specific geometry of being 3 steps behind Sovereign, something that still let him be what he was without having to be everything it demanded. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something too personal for an archive to hold. What I do know is this. 18 months after the Accords, General Sovereign gave an interview to the Coalition Military Review, a rare thing. Cathali generals don't typically do press, in which she discussed, briefly, her experience of the Tarakan negotiations. She spoke about the clauses, the collective's withdrawal, the eventual outcome. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked her about her support staff, a standard closing question, the kind meant to humanize a figure who can otherwise come across as purely institutional. Wren said, "I have excellent advisors." And I have, she paused, and in the transcript that pause is rendered as a standard pause, but I've read enough transcripts to know when a pause means something. I have someone who ensures that the situations I need to address are the ones that matter. I don't always know how. I've stopped asking. The journalist asked if she could be more specific. Wren said, "His name is Marcus. He's very good at carrying things." And then she moved on to the next question. I think about that line more than I probably should. He's very good at carrying things. The data pad, the thermal container, the intelligence she didn't know she was receiving, the pressure conversations she didn't know had been quietly structured to her advantage. The chemical threat she didn't know had been discovered and removed. The 4 Tarakan operatives she didn't know had been standing down because of a man she'd never looked at directly. He carried all of it. And she never knew. Or she knew just enough to know she didn't know everything, and she'd made her peace with that, and she went on. There's something in that, I think, about the nature of protection, about the people who stand 3 steps behind the important ones and do the invisible work that makes the important things possible. They don't ask to be seen. They don't need the credit, or at least they've made themselves not need it. They carry what needs carrying, and they're very good at it, and they don't tell you what it cost them. The galaxy found out eventually. They always do. Not through an inquiry, not through an official disclosure, through the Tarakan Collective of all places. 8 months after Wren's military review interview, the collective published what they called a Security Incident Assessment Retrospective, a routine document that most intelligence organizations file away without reading. But buried in the appendix of that document, under a section about observer protocol lapses at multilateral events, was a paragraph. It described an incident at an unspecified coalition diplomatic event, involving an unspecified number of collective observer personnel, who had been, in the document's careful phrasing, deterred from completing their operational parameters by the unexpected presence of a coalition-affiliated individual bearing active Reaper-class behavioral indicators. The document went on to recommend updated observer protocols and new vetting procedures for any coalition-adjacent events that might involve Reaper-class assets. The document was not classified. It was published in the Collective's Standard Assessment Archive, which is technically open to registered researchers. Within 3 weeks, someone had picked it up. Not a journalist, a researcher at the Arson Institute for Interspecies Security Studies, who published a brief analytical note noting the Collective's reference and asking the question that the document had very carefully not answered. Who, specifically, was this individual, and under what auspices were they operating at a coalition diplomatic event? The analytical note was brief and dry, and probably read by 200 people. But 2 of those 200 people were journalists at the Coalition Dispatch, and one of them had a source in the Bureau who, I am not proud to say, probably included information from the general vicinity of my inquiry about Croft. The story ran 6 weeks after the analytical note. It was careful, the journalist knew enough to be careful, knew that being too specific about something this sensitive was how you got stories killed before they published. But it was clear enough. A human aide attached to a senior Cathali military commander, a Tarakan security assessment referencing Reaper-class indicators, an unspecified diplomatic event with security implications that had not been publicly disclosed. The story didn't name Croft, it referred to him as the human aide. Within 48 hours of publication, it was everywhere. Every species-specific media network in the Outer Rim had picked it up. The framing varied. The Marathi press was interested in the security implications for their own diplomatic events. The Velkin press was interested in the coalition policy questions around Reaper-class assets. The Drekari communication networks were doing their characteristically odd approach of releasing multiple simultaneous interpretations and letting the audience resolve them. But the core of the story, the image, the thing that people latched onto, was the same everywhere. A human, a nobody, an aide with a data pad, 3 steps behind a Cathali general who didn't know his name. And the Tarakan Collective's operatives had seen him and stopped. That's the part that got to people, that's the part that spread. Not the intelligence mechanics, not the Accord's implications, not the policy debate about Reaper-class assets operating in diplomatic spaces. The image, the human nobody who made the Collective's trained operatives stop moving. There's something about that image that travels well across species lines. I don't entirely understand why, but I've thought about it. Every species has stories about hidden power, the figure who appears unremarkable, who occupies the edges of events, who nobody looks at directly, and who turns out to be the most significant person in the room. It's an old story in every culture I know of. It speaks to something that runs deeper than species. The galaxy told it to itself for weeks. I heard, through sources I won't specify, that when the story reached the INS Velorath, the ship had returned to active duty by then, on a different mission. General Sova Wren was given a summary of the coverage by one of her advisors. I heard that she read it. Read the whole thing, which is not what powerful Cathali generals typically do with press coverage. I heard that she read the part about the chemical dispersal device on sublevel 3. I heard that her bioluminescent filaments went very bright, very briefly, in a pattern that the Cathali advisors in the room later described as indicating a category of emotion that doesn't translate cleanly into coalition standard. Something adjacent to what humans might call the feeling of realizing you have been more cared for than you knew. I heard that she was quiet for a moment, and then I heard that she asked where Croft was. He was in the aide quarters, which was where he always was when he wasn't needed, quiet, out of the way, unremarked. She sent for him. The conversation that happened when he came to her was private. I don't know what was said. No one who was there told me, and I didn't ask. What I know is that after the conversation, Croft's title on the Cathali delegation's official manifest was changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't changed to anything that would make headlines or require a formal announcement. It was changed from administrative aide, secondary class to senior counsel special functions, which is not a Catholic designation I was familiar with. I ran it through the Bureau's translation database, and the closest equivalent I found was, and I want to be precise about this, the one who sees what I cannot afford to miss. I've been writing this account for the better part of a year. I wrote it first as a Bureau report, which was reviewed, classified, and filed in a restricted archive. I wrote a second version for myself, longer and less precise, the version that holds the parts that reports aren't designed to hold, the corridor conversation, the look on Wren's face when she recalibrated, the heavy set of Croft's shoulders in the moment he thought no one was watching. This is the third version, the one I'm calling a witness account, the one that lives in the same archive as the formal report but means something different. I don't know where Croft is now. Presumably still with the Catholic delegation, still 3 steps behind the general, though the general now knows what those 3 steps have been costing someone, and I suspect the geometry of the relationship has shifted in ways that the official record won't capture. I hope he's doing all right. That's a strange thing to write about someone I met once in a corridor for 30 seconds, but I mean it. The last thing I'll tell you is this. A month after the Coalition Dispatch story broke, I was at an interagency briefing at Bureau headquarters. Routine stuff, threat assessments, protocol updates, the usual institutional maintenance. One of the senior analysts was presenting on the Tarakan Collective's changed posture following their withdrawal from the Accords process, and she was running through the incident assessment retrospective I mentioned, the one with the Reaper class paragraph. She pulled up the paragraph, she read it aloud for the room, and she said, "The interesting thing about this document is that it treats the presence of a Reaper class asset at the event as a breach of protocol, as something that shouldn't have happened." She paused. "But our records indicate the asset in question was operating legitimately within the scope of their registered assignment. There was no breach of protocol. He was just there, doing his job." Someone in the room asked what the collective's operatives had done when they recognized him. She said they stopped. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back, I didn't see who, someone junior, someone who probably regretted saying it out loud about 2 seconds after they did, said, "They just stopped, because of one human." The senior analyst looked at her screen for a moment. Then she said, "The Tarakan Collective has operational files on every known Reaper-class asset. They've been building those files for 30 years. These are very thorough files, very detailed, the kind of detail that takes a long time and a lot of losses to compile." She closed the document. When you've spent 30 years building a file on someone, when you know everything that file contains, and then that person is suddenly standing in a room, looking at you, she shrugged, very slightly, the shrug of someone making a point that needs no additional decoration. Yes, you stop. She's right. That's the whole story, actually. That's the thing beneath everything else. The Tarakan Collective's operatives weren't afraid of a man. They were afraid of a file. They were afraid of everything that file contained, every operation documented in it, every outcome recorded in it, the sum total of what one person had done in the years before he put on a charcoal gray Aide's uniform and started carrying a thermal container. And the terrible, clarifying, somehow almost beautiful thing about it is that Croft himself had tried to leave that file behind, had walked away from it and chosen something smaller and quieter, had spent 11 months being the person who carries things, invisible, unremarked, 3 steps behind a woman who didn't know his name. And it followed him anyway. It always follows them. That's what the designation means, that's what it costs. He'd carried his general's coffee and her intelligence and her safety and the invisible weight of everything he'd done before. And he'd done it without asking for anything, without showing anything, without needing anyone in the room to see. And then one night, in a room with a purple-sheened hull and a nebula glowing amber outside the windows, when he needed them to see, he let them.